The prisoner who found redemption in the most unexpected way. When a man who once took a life walked out of prison after 20 years, no one expected what he would do next. For most people, redemption is just a word, something you say to ease the pain of guilt. But for Daniel Reeves, it became his life's mission. This is the story of how a convicted murderer found redemption in the most unexpected way. Daniel Reeves was born in the small town of Brookhaven, Mississippi, a place where time seemed to move a little slower, and everyone knew everyone else's story. The streets were lined with old oak trees that had seen generations grow, love, and fade away. The church bells rang every Sunday morning, and the local diner was where gossip traveled faster than the morning coffee. It was a town that looked peaceful from the outside, but for Daniel, home was never peaceful. He was the second of 3 children raised in a weathered wooden house that leaned slightly to one side. His mother, Martha, worked double shifts at the local nursing home, often returning late at night with aching feet and eyes heavy from exhaustion. His father, Roy, was once a promising carpenter, but years of alcohol and frustration turned him into something else, a man haunted by disappointment and bitterness. Daniel's earliest memories were filled with shouting matches that echoed through thin walls, his father's voice slurred with anger, and the crash of bottles shattering against the floor. He learned early how to read the silence that followed, when to stay hidden, when to protect his younger sister, when to simply disappear. By the age of 10, Daniel had already seen enough of life's unfairness to harden his heart. He wasn't a bad kid at first. His teachers said he was smart, bright, even when he tried. But trying didn't come easy when you went to school hungry and came home to chaos. He started skipping classes, hanging around older kids who saw trouble as a kind of freedom. They smoked behind the football field, bragged about fights, and laughed about getting away with small crimes, stealing candy, vandalizing walls, skipping town curfews. To Daniel, it felt like belonging. By 15, he was drinking. By 17, he was getting into fights. Every punch he threw wasn't really about the person in front of him. It was about the anger inside him, the pain that never found the right words. He hated being told he'd never make it out of town, and he hated himself for believing it might be true. When his mother begged him to stay out of trouble, he would storm out of the house, promising himself he'd never turn into his father. But deep down, he could feel the same fire burning, that uncontrollable rage that made the world blur into red. After high school, Daniel tried to straighten out. He got a job at a local auto shop, fixing engines and changing oil for barely enough money to get by. He liked the work. It was honest, mechanical, predictable. Machines made sense in a way people didn't. But even then, the quiet moments between jobs left him restless. He'd watch his friends move on, go to college, start families, while he stayed in the same small town that always felt too small for his regrets. Then came the night that would change everything. It was late, the kind of humid southern night where the air feels thick enough to choke on. The neon lights from the Rusty Nail, a local bar on the edge of town, glowed like a warning. Daniel wasn't much of a drinker anymore, but that night he'd had enough on his mind to make an exception. He'd lost his job earlier that day after arguing with his boss, who told him he needed to get his attitude under control. Inside the bar, the air smelled of stale beer and cheap whiskey. Country music hummed in the background as men leaned over pool tables and clinked bottles. Daniel sat at the counter, his mind spinning, when he heard a familiar voice behind him, Steve Callahan. Steve was a local mechanic, older than Daniel by a few years. They'd gone to the same high school, though Steve had always been the golden boy, easygoing, friendly, and respected. But that night, a simple misunderstanding between them, a spilled drink, a sharp word turned into something darker. "Watch where you're going," Steve had said, his tone casual but sharp enough to cut. Daniel turned, eyes narrowed. "You think I did that on purpose?" Steve laughed. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder, Reeves. Maybe it's time you let it go." Those words, simple, meaningless to anyone else, hit something deep. Years of resentment, anger, and shame boiled over. Before Daniel could think, his hand clenched into a fist, and he swung. It was a single punch, just one. But it landed hard, too hard. Steve fell backward, his head hitting the edge of a metal bar stool before crashing to the floor. The bar fell silent. Someone screamed. Daniel froze, his heart pounding, the world spinning in slow motion. He knelt beside Steve, shaking him, calling his name, but Steve didn't move. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and spreading fast. By the time the ambulance arrived, Steve Callahan was already gone. Daniel was arrested that night. The mugshot taken of him, a young man with glassy eyes and a face torn between rage and regret, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The charge was manslaughter. He claimed it was an accident, a moment of anger gone too far. The prosecution painted it as reckless violence. The courtroom was packed during his trial. Small-town justice moved quickly, and everyone had an opinion. Steve's family sat in the front row, silent but shattered. His mother wept quietly, clutching a photo of her son. Daniel's mother, sitting just a few seats away, could barely lift her eyes. Her son, the boy she once rocked to sleep, was now being called a killer. When the verdict came, the words seemed to echo forever. Guilty of manslaughter, 25 years in state prison. Daniel didn't fight it. He didn't cry. He simply stared ahead, as if his soul had already left the room. When the guards led him away, his mother tried to reach out to touch his arm, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. Prison was another world, cold, unforgiving, and filled with rules that changed depending on who was watching. From the first day, Daniel realized survival meant becoming harder than the place itself. He learned to fight, to stay quiet, to keep his emotions buried beneath layers of toughness. Every day was a battle, against others, against boredom, against himself. He got into fights, sometimes to defend himself, other times just to feel something other than guilt. Each punch, each scar felt like punishment. But deep down, the truth was unbearable. He wasn't angry at the world anymore. He was angry at himself. Letters came from his mother in the first few years, long emotional messages about forgiveness, about keeping faith, about staying strong. But Daniel rarely read them. They reminded him of a world he didn't deserve to return to. After a while, the letters stopped coming. He told himself it didn't matter, that family only brings weakness in a place like this. But every night, when the lights went out and the noise of the prison faded into distant echoes, he'd see Steve's face. Not the man he punched, but the man who never got up. Years passed. His hair grew thinner, his body hardened, his eyes colder. He became known among inmates as someone you didn't cross. The guards saw him as trouble, a ticking time bomb. The system had no interest in helping him heal, only in keeping him locked away. But sometimes, redemption begins where hope has already died. It started with a book. One of the older inmates, a man named Henry who'd been serving life for armed robbery, handed it to him one day in the yard. It was worn, the cover barely attached. "Something to pass the time," Henry said. Daniel didn't care much for reading, but something about Henry's calm voice made him take it. That night, he opened it. It was a book of poetry, strange, emotional, raw. He didn't understand all of it, but one line caught his attention: "The wound is where the light enters you." He read it again, and again. The next day, he asked Henry what it meant. Henry just smiled. "You'll figure it out when you're ready." That small moment became a turning point, one Daniel wouldn't recognize until much later. For the first time in years, he started to think about choices, about consequences, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. Still, he fought that thought. Change meant facing pain, and pain was something he'd spent years running from. But the world has a strange way of forcing lessons upon those who need them most. Daniel's breaking point came during his 8th year in prison, when everything he thought he knew about himself was tested. By then, he had a reputation: dangerous, unpredictable, someone the guards kept an eye on. He had no friends, only alliances built on fear. He'd stopped expecting anything good to happen to him. Then came the riot. It started small, a disagreement in the yard, a few shouts, a shove. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Inmates were fighting everywhere, guards rushing in with batons and shields. Daniel was in the middle of it, trying to stay alive. And then he saw it, a young inmate, barely 18, cornered by 3 men twice his size. The kid's face was terrified, pleading. For a moment, Daniel froze. It wasn't his fight. But then something inside him snapped. He rushed in, pulling the attackers away, throwing punches, blocking hits. By the time guards arrived, Daniel was bleeding, bruised, and standing over the boy like a shield. Both were dragged away and thrown into solitary confinement. Sitting in that cold, silent cell, Daniel expected nothing but punishment. But a few days later, the warden called him in. The young inmate, Elijah, had spoken up. He told them Daniel had saved his life. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't seen as a threat. He was seen as human. And that small recognition, that one spark of decency in a dark world, lit something inside him he thought was long dead: compassion. It was the moment everything began to shift. From that day forward, Daniel started to change. Not overnight, not with grand gestures, but slowly, like ice melting after a long winter. He began reading again, writing, thinking, searching for meaning in a place built to destroy it. And though no one else could see it yet, Daniel Reeves was on the path to becoming someone entirely different, someone the world never believed he could be. Someone who would one day discover redemption in the most unexpected way. Is this conversation helpful so far? It happened during his 8th year behind bars. By then, Daniel Reeves had long accepted that prison wasn't just a place he lived, it was the only world he knew. Every clang of the metal doors, every shouted order from a guard, every sleepless night on a thin mattress had become part of his existence. The prison yard was his daily stage, a concrete field surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire that shimmered under the hot Mississippi sun. He had learned the rhythm of survival: keep your head down, stay quiet, and never look too long into another man's eyes. In a place like that, respect was currency, and weakness was blood in the water. That day started like any other. The yard was buzzing with noise, some inmates lifting weights, others huddled in groups, smoking, playing cards, or just watching. The guards stood on the towers above, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes scanning the yard with practiced indifference. Daniel sat on a bench near the basketball court, reading a worn-out book he'd borrowed from the prison library. It was The Count of Monte Cristo, a story about a man wrongfully imprisoned who finds freedom through faith, patience, and revenge. Daniel didn't see himself as Edmond Dantes. He was guilty. He had killed a man. But something about that story, about the pain of confinement and the long road toward redemption, spoke to him deeply. He had just turned a page when the tension in the air changed. It was subtle at first, the way voices got louder, movement sharper, laughter dying into silence. He looked up and saw it happening. A group of inmates from one of the prison gangs, men covered in tattoos that marked loyalty and violence, had surrounded a new arrival. The kid couldn't have been more than 18 or 19. Skinny, nervous, clutching his tray from lunch like a shield. The way he looked around reminded Daniel of a deer trapped in headlights, scared, confused, and completely out of his depth. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running from his lip to his ear, shoved the boy hard against the wall. "You new here, huh?" he sneered. "You don't walk through our yard without showing respect." The kid stammered something Daniel couldn't hear. The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. Daniel felt that familiar surge of adrenaline in his chest. He'd seen moments like this before. He'd been part of moments like this before. Prison was a place that fed on fear, and every act of mercy was seen as weakness. But something about the look in that boy's eyes, something broke inside Daniel. It was the same helpless look he remembered from that night outside the bar, the night that ruined everything. The look of a man who didn't know his next breath would be his last. The group closed in. One of them grabbed the boy by the collar and swung. The first hit sent him crashing to the ground. Another kick landed, then another. Blood hit the concrete. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to stay out of it. You don't get involved. Not here. Not if you want to live. But this time, he didn't listen. He dropped his book, stood up, and walked toward the chaos. At first, no one noticed him. Then the leader turned and laughed. What's this, Reeves? You want to play hero now? Daniel didn't answer. He just moved. He shoved the first man aside, grabbed another by the shoulders, and threw him down. The impact drew gasps from the inmates nearby. The fight exploded like a match to gasoline, fists flying, bodies colliding, guards shouting from the towers. The young inmate tried to crawl away, but one of the gang members lunged toward him with a shiv, crudely carved metal glinting in the sunlight. Daniel saw it happen in slow motion. Without thinking, he dove forward, tackling the attacker to the ground. The blade sliced through his arm, but he didn't stop. He wrestled the weapon away and kicked it across the yard. By the time the guards fired warning shots into the air, the yard was a storm of movement and noise. Daniel was on top of the attacker, breathing hard, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The guards stormed in, batons out, shouting orders. Within seconds, everyone was face down on the ground. Reeves, what the hell are you doing? One of the guards barked. Daniel didn't answer. He looked over at the young inmate, the boy he'd just protected. He was trembling, his lips split, blood dripping from his nose. But he was alive. That night, both men were dragged into solitary confinement. The punishment was automatic. Anyone involved in a fight got isolation. The cell was cold and bare, a concrete box with a metal door that clanged shut like a gunshot. For most inmates, solitary was torture. For Daniel, it was a strange kind of peace. He sat there, staring at the wall, feeling the sting in his arm where the knife had cut him. He replayed the fight in his mind, the panic, the decision, the way everything went silent when he saw that weapon. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel empty. The next day, he was called into the warden's office. 2 guards escorted him, their boots echoing through the corridor. Inside, the warden sat behind a wooden desk, arms folded, eyes sharp. Beside him was a counselor and the young inmate, Elijah. Elijah looked small in that room, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. Sir, he saved my life. The warden frowned. You sure about that? Elijah nodded quickly. They were gonna kill me. He stopped them. He didn't have to, but he did. The room went silent for a moment. The warden studied Daniel, his expression unreadable. You could have been killed out there, Reeves, he said finally. Why'd you do it? Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to that kind of question. He'd lived years without anyone caring about his motives. He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. I don't know, he said quietly. Maybe. I just didn't want to see another kid lose his life for nothing. The warden didn't reply. He just nodded slowly, then turned to the guard. Take him back. But that moment, Elijah's voice, the look in his eyes, it stayed with Daniel. For the first time in years, someone had seen him as more than a criminal number, more than the man who made one terrible mistake. Someone had seen him as human. That night, back in his cell, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Elijah. The fear in the boy's eyes, the gratitude, the trust. It was a strange thing to feel in a place built to crush hope. Days turned into weeks. Elijah eventually returned to the general population, and Daniel saw him occasionally in the yard. They never talked much. Conversations between inmates were always watched, but they exchanged nods, quiet acknowledgments that said more than words could. Then one afternoon, Elijah slipped Daniel a folded note during lunch. It read, "You're the first person who ever stood up for me. I won't forget that." Daniel read it over and over. It was such a small thing, just a few lines on scrap paper. But it cracked something open inside him. That night, he sat on his bunk with a dull pencil and a few sheets of paper and began to write. At first, he didn't know what to say. But the words came slowly, awkward, uncertain but honest. He wrote to Steve Callahan's family, the man he'd killed. He told them how sorry he was, how not a day passed that he didn't think about what he'd done. He told them about the riot, about saving Elijah, about how that moment made him realize what it truly meant to take a life, and what it could mean to save one. He didn't know if he'd ever send it, but the act of writing felt like breathing for the first time in years. The next night, he wrote again. This time the letter was to the parole board, not to beg for freedom, but to tell them what he'd learned. He wrote about anger and guilt, about the cost of violence, about how punishment wasn't just what the system gave him, it was what he carried inside. And then he wrote a third letter. This one was to himself. To the boy I used to be, it began. The one who thought being tough was the same as being strong. The one who didn't know how to walk away. I forgive you, but you have to do better now. That letter never left his cell. He folded it carefully and tucked it inside the pages of the Count of Monte Cristo. From that day forward, Daniel changed. He stopped fighting. He stopped cursing the world. He started spending time in the library, volunteering to help other inmates learn to read. He found peace in quiet moments, the sound of turning pages, the scratch of a pencil, the rare smile from someone who used to fear him. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. He had saved one life in a place that destroyed so many. It didn't erase his past, and it didn't bring back Steve Callahan. But it meant something. It meant there was still a part of him that could do good. And in a place built on despair, that was everything. The riot that day was supposed to be just another act of violence in a prison full of it. But for Daniel Reeves, it became the turning point, the spark that ignited his long road toward redemption. He didn't know it yet, but that single act of courage would ripple far beyond the walls of the prison. It would reach people he never met, touch lives he didn't know existed, and one day it would bring him face to face with the very forgiveness he never thought he deserved. Because in saving someone else, Daniel had unknowingly begun the process of saving himself. Years passed inside the cold stone walls that had once felt like Daniel Reeves' punishment and now felt more like his classroom. The man who had entered prison angry, bitter, and broken had slowly become something no one expected, calm, reflective, and deeply remorseful. He had spent so many nights staring at the ceiling, haunted by one question that never left him: why did I do it? He could still see the moment as if it were happening again. The flashing red and blue lights. The way Steve Callahan's body went limp. The screams. The silence. The way his mother looked at him from the courtroom bench, not with anger, but with unbearable sorrow. That memory became his punishment far more than any sentence a judge could deliver. Over time, Daniel learned to stop fighting the system and start understanding himself. In the first few years, he had been known as trouble, angry, unpredictable, the kind of inmate the guards kept an eye on. But something inside him began to shift after that night in the yard, the night he protected Elijah, the young inmate who reminded him so much of himself. When he saw the fear in Elijah's eyes, Daniel saw his own younger reflection, lost, impulsive, desperate for belonging. Saving Elijah that night had stirred something human in him again, something he thought had died the day he took a life. He started seeking out peace wherever he could find it, in books, in silence, in the rhythm of daily routine. He began attending a prison Bible study group, not because he wanted forgiveness, but because he wanted to understand why he had become the person who needed it. The chaplain, an older man named Father Mitchell, saw something in Daniel. He once told him, "Redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. It's about what you do with what's left of your life." Those words stayed with Daniel for years. He enrolled in a prison education program and began taking college courses through correspondence. It started with basic classes: English composition, sociology, psychology. But when he discovered a program in social work, something clicked. He wanted to learn why people like him, people from broken homes, people who never got a fair chance, ended up lost. Studying gave him purpose. For the first time, his days weren't just about surviving, they were about growing. He would sit by the barred window for hours, reading case studies about rehabilitation, trauma, and recovery. He wrote essays by hand and mailed them to professors he would never meet. When he finally earned his degree, the warden personally handed him the certificate. It wasn't freedom, but it felt like the first step toward it. Over time, Daniel became a quiet leader inside those walls. He volunteered to tutor other inmates, teaching them how to read, helping them fill out forms, or just listening when they needed someone to talk to. Many of the younger inmates began to look up to him. Some even called him coach because he always pushed them to be better, even when they didn't believe they could be. There was one young man in particular, Marcus, who had arrived at the prison at just 19. Angry, wild, ready to fight everyone. Daniel saw too much of himself in that kid. He took Marcus under his wing, helping him stay out of trouble, guiding him toward education programs instead of gangs. Years later, Marcus would tell Daniel, "You saved my life." It was strange, Daniel thought. Once upon a time, he had taken a life, and now maybe he was saving them. As the years turned into decades, the parole hearings came and went. At first, they denied him almost immediately. His file still said violent offender. His past couldn't be erased by good behavior alone. But Daniel didn't give up. He continued working, studying, and helping. He wrote essays about rehabilitation that were published in small journals. His story even reached advocacy groups that believed in second chances. By the time his next parole hearing approached, his third in 20 years, Daniel was 61 years old. His hair had turned gray, and his hands were marked with the lines of age and hard work. But his eyes carried peace. When he entered the parole room that day, it was silent except for the sound of shuffling papers. 3 board members sat at a long table. Behind them, the state flag hung against the wall. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Daniel sat down and folded his hands in his lap. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times in his mind, but as the moment arrived, his heart pounded. The first board member, an older man with stern features, began reading from his file. "Mr. Reeves, you were convicted of manslaughter in 2005. You've served 20 years of a 25-year sentence. During your incarceration, you've received multiple commendations for mentorship and education programs. However," he paused, "the nature of your crime remains severe. Tell us, why should we believe you're no longer a danger to society?" Daniel looked down for a moment, gathering himself. He didn't want to sound rehearsed. He didn't want to beg. He simply wanted to tell the truth. "Because I learned what taking a life really means," he said quietly. "It doesn't end with one moment. It ripples through time, through families, through memories. I carry that with me every single day. I can't undo what I did, but I've spent the last 20 years trying to make sure I never waste the time I was given." There was a pause. The second board member, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses, spoke next. "You've completed a degree in social work. Why that field?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Because it's about understanding people. It's about helping those who fall through the cracks. I used to be one of them. Maybe I still am. But I've learned that if someone had reached me before that night, if someone had shown me how to deal with anger, how to face pain, maybe none of this would have happened. I want to be that person for someone else." For a moment, no one spoke. The woman nodded slowly, jotting something down. Then came the final question from the youngest member of the board, Dr. Caroline Hayes. Her tone was soft but piercing. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "after all these years, why do you think you deserve freedom?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't," he said. His voice trembled slightly. "I don't think I deserve freedom. Steve Callahan doesn't get a second chance, so why should I? But what I do believe is that I can spend the rest of my life giving back what I took away. I can't change my past, but maybe I can help someone else change theirs." The room fell silent. There was no sound, not even the scratch of a pen. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. Daniel lowered his gaze again. "Every night, I think about his family," he continued softly. "His daughter. His wife. I know my words can't bring them peace, but I've tried to live in a way that honors the man I took from this world. I mentor young men who remind me of myself at 21, angry, lost, full of excuses. I tell them there's no excuse for what I did, but there's still a choice for what they can become." He exhaled slowly. "That's what freedom means to me. Not walking outside these walls, but living a life that makes those walls mean something." No one interrupted. The members exchanged glances, but their expressions revealed nothing. After a moment, the chairman cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. We will review your file and notify you of our decision in due time." Daniel nodded respectfully and stood. As he walked out of that small, fluorescent-lit room, he didn't feel fear. He didn't feel hope either. Just acceptance. He had told the truth, and for him, that was enough. The days that followed felt endless. Every sound of footsteps in the corridor made his heart skip. He tried to keep busy, cleaning, reading, helping in the library. But inside, a quiet storm brewed, the waiting, the wondering, the fragile thread of possibility. 3 weeks later, it happened. A guard came to his cell one morning, holding a small brown envelope. "Reeves," he said flatly, "parole board's decision." Daniel's hands trembled as he took it. He sat down on the edge of his bunk and stared at the seal. Part of him didn't want to open it, as if the act of not knowing would keep the hope alive just a little longer. Finally, he tore it open. The letter was short, formal, just a few lines. "After careful review of your case and record of rehabilitation, the board has voted in favor of parole. Effective immediately, you are to be released under supervision." He read it twice, then a third time. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He was free. Fears blurred his vision as he pressed the letter against his chest. He thought of Steve Callahan, of his mother, of Elijah, of Marcus, of every moment that had brought him to this one. Freedom didn't feel like joy. It felt like gravity lifting, like a weight slowly easing after years of bearing it. On the morning of his release, Daniel walked toward the gates with a small bag of belongings, 2 books, a photo of his mother, and a journal filled with letters he'd written but never sent. The sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and gold. It was the first sunrise he had seen without bars since his 20s. He stood there for a long time, taking it in. When the gates opened, Daniel stepped outside. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes. The air smelled different, free yet heavy with memory. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't to anyone in particular, maybe to life itself. After 20 long years, Daniel Reeves was no longer inmate number 47209. He was a man reborn, not cleansed of guilt but defined by the strength it took to face it. And though the world outside had changed, new buildings, new faces, new rules, one thing in Daniel hadn't: his promise. He had vowed to make amends, to live the rest of his life for something bigger than himself. The journey that began with violence and loss had transformed into one of healing and purpose. And as he walked away from those iron gates, his steps were slow but steady, each one carrying him further from who he once was, and closer to who he was meant to be. Is this conversation helpful so far? When Daniel Reeves stepped out of the gates of Millstone Penitentiary, he felt sunlight on his skin for the first time in 2 decades. It was warm, almost unfamiliar. He blinked at the brightness, clutching a small box that held everything he owned: a worn Bible, a few folded letters he'd written but never sent, and a photograph of his mother taken years before she passed away. The world outside had changed. The cars were faster, the people busier, and the silence between moments felt strange after years of constant noise inside prison walls. He took a slow breath and whispered to himself, "Start over." But starting over was harder than he imagined. Daniel found work cleaning floors at a local church. The pastor, a gentle man named Reverend Collins, knew about Daniel's past but believed in second chances. He didn't ask questions, he just handed Daniel a mop and said, "Everyone deserves a clean start, son, even if it begins with a broom." Daniel was grateful. But the nights were still hard. He often woke up drenched in sweat, haunted by the sound of that single, fatal punch, the moment that took a life and broke his own. Months passed quietly until one Sunday afternoon, as he was sweeping the church hallway, Reverend Collins approached him. "There's a youth center downtown," he said. "They need volunteers. Maybe you could talk to the boys. You've seen things. Maybe they need someone who's been there." At first, Daniel hesitated. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," he said softly. But the Reverend smiled. "Maybe you're exactly the right person." The next week, Daniel walked into the Eastbrook Youth Center, a small, struggling facility filled with kids who had nowhere else to go. The walls were painted with fading murals of hope, but you could feel the weight of despair in the air. Broken families, broken trust, broken futures. Daniel recognized those eyes, the same kind of defiance and fear he'd once carried. He started small, helping with homework, leading discussions about life choices, and teaching basic skills. At first, the teens ignored him, laughing behind his back. To them, he was just another adult trying to preach about doing the right thing. But Daniel didn't preach. He listened. And slowly, they started to talk. He became a quiet constant in their lives. The man who didn't judge, didn't shout, didn't walk away. One of those teens was a 16-year-old boy named Chris. Chris had been in and out of juvenile detention since he was 13. Theft, fights, vandalism. He wore his anger like armor. Everyone at the center called him trouble, but Daniel saw something different. He saw a boy trying to survive in a world that had already labeled him lost. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, Daniel found Chris sitting alone on the steps outside, his head buried in his hands. The boy's knuckles were bruised, his voice shaking when he finally spoke. "They caught me again," he said. "Stole a car. Said I'll be sent away this time. I'm done, man. I can't fix this." Daniel sat beside him. The air was cold and still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, "You know, there was a time I thought the same thing. That I couldn't fix anything. That I didn't deserve another chance." Chris looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated. He'd never told anyone at the center about his past. The Reverend knew, of course, but to the rest of the world he was just Daniel, the quiet janitor who volunteered with the kids. But something in Chris's eyes reminded him of who he used to be. Angry, lost, alone. So Daniel took a deep breath and told him everything. He told him about the night outside the bar, how anger clouded his judgment, how one impulsive moment of rage took another man's life. He described the trial, the judge's cold stare, the 25-year sentence. He spoke of the first years in prison, the violence, the isolation, the hate that festered inside him. And then he told him about Elijah, the young inmate he'd saved during the riot. The moment that changed everything. The night he realized that protecting someone else, even for a second, could heal something deep within. Chris sat in silence, stunned. "You killed someone?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, and I live with that every day. But that's not the end of my story. I learned that redemption isn't about erasing your past. It's about changing what you do with the time you have left." Chris didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "You think people like us can really change?" Daniel really looked at him and said, "I don't just think it, I live it." That moment marked a turning point for both of them. Over the next few months, Chris began showing up more often. He stopped skipping classes, stopped getting into fights. Daniel helped him get a part-time job at a repair shop, taught him how to manage money, and even helped him study for his GED. Word spread around the neighborhood about Daniel's work. Parents started bringing their kids to the center, hoping the man who'd helped Chris could help their sons too. Some of them were skeptical when they learned his past. But when they saw the results, when they saw their children start to believe in themselves again, they understood. Daniel didn't ask for recognition. He didn't want his name in the papers or awards on his wall. His satisfaction came from small victories: a boy graduating, a girl getting a scholarship, a letter from a parent saying thank you. He had finally found peace in serving others. But life, as it often does, had one more test waiting for him. One gray afternoon, after a long day at the center, Daniel returned home to find an envelope in his mailbox. No return address, just his name written in soft, careful handwriting. He sat on his porch, opened it, and began to read. Inside was a letter. It began with 4 words that froze him completely. "I am Steve Callahan's daughter." Daniel's heart stopped. His hands trembled as he read on. She wrote, "I used to hate you. I thought about the night you took my father's life every single day. I imagined what you looked like, who you were, and why you did it. I told myself that forgiveness was impossible. But over the years, I realized that hate only kept me trapped in the same pain you must have felt. I heard about your work at the youth center. I don't know how, but I did, and I've seen what you're doing, helping kids find the path my father always believed in. He used to say, everyone deserves a chance to do better, no matter how far they've fallen. When I read about you, I realized something. You've honored his memory in a way I never thought possible. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive completely, but I don't hate you anymore. Maybe this is what peace looks like." The letter ended with a single line that shattered Daniel's composure. "I think he'd be proud of what you've become." For a long time, Daniel just sat there, the paper trembling in his hands, his eyes filling with tears. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. He never expected forgiveness, not after what he'd done. He thought redemption was something he had to build alone. But in that moment, reading those words, he realized something profound. Redemption isn't something you earn. It's something you accept when you finally learn to forgive yourself. He cried until the sun went down, the letter clutched against his chest. The next day, Daniel walked into the youth center with renewed purpose. He gathered the kids and told them something he'd never said before. "I don't stand here because I'm better than any of you," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "I stand here because I've made every mistake you can imagine. But I'm proof that even when you've done the worst thing possible, you can still choose to do something good. Every single day is a choice to destroy or to rebuild. I chose to rebuild." The room was silent. Then Chris, now wearing his new work uniform, stood up and said, "If he can do it, so can we." Laughter broke through the tension and applause followed. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel like an ex-convict trying to make amends. He felt like a man finally living his purpose. Years passed, and Daniel's work grew beyond the small center. He founded a non-profit organization called Second Step, a mentorship program for former inmates and at-risk youth. He spoke at schools, community centers, even prisons, sharing his story not as a tale of guilt, but as proof of transformation. At one event, after speaking to a room full of inmates, a young man approached him and said, "You gave me hope. I thought my life was over. But now I see that it's just beginning." Daniel smiled and replied, "Then that means I've done something right." As his program grew, so did his impact. But Daniel remained humble, still living in the same small apartment, still volunteering every week. Fame wasn't what he wanted, peace was. And now, at last, he had it. One evening, years later, Daniel received another letter. This time, it wasn't from Steve Callahan's daughter, but from her son, a boy who had never met his grandfather but who had heard stories about him. The letter was short but powerful. Mr. Reeves, I wanted to thank you. My mother told me about the letter she sent you years ago. I didn't understand then, but now I do. You turned your mistake into something that saved lives. I don't think my grandfather would have wanted his death to end another life too. You gave his memory purpose again. Thank you. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the first one, both now worn and yellowed with age. He often reread them at night when doubts crept back in, reminding himself that redemption wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about what you do after you receive it. He spent the rest of his life continuing that mission, guiding, teaching, rebuilding. He never remarried, never left the small town, and never stopped believing in the power of change. When he passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 63, the news spread through the town like a soft whisper of loss. Hundreds attended his memorial. Former inmates, young men and women he had mentored, police officers, judges, even the daughter of Steve Callahan. She stood at the front of the room, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the framed photograph of Daniel. When it was her turn to speak, she said only one thing. He took something precious from me once, but he spent the rest of his life giving back to others. That's more than redemption, that's grace. The room fell silent. Daniel Reeves was laid to rest under a large oak tree near the youth center he had helped build. On his tombstone, carved beneath his name, were 5 simple words. He found peace at last. And in that quiet town, his story lived on, told by those he saved, whispered in classrooms, retold in prison programs across the country. Because Daniel's life had become a testament to something greater than justice, the belief that even the most broken souls can find light again. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive in the form of applause or recognition. Sometimes it comes as a quiet letter written by the daughter of the man whose life you once took. And sometimes, it comes when you finally forgive yourself. This was another story from True Justice Stories. If you believe in second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real tales where truth meets justice. Is this conversation helpful so far? Years later, Daniel Reeves passed away quietly in his sleep. On his tombstone, engraved were 5 simple words. He found peace at last. His story became a lesson shared in prisons and schools alike, proof that no one is beyond redemption, no matter their past. Because sometimes, the most broken people are the ones who learn how to rebuild others. This was another story from True Justice Stories. If you believe in second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real tales where truth meets justice.